recent Iowa State University study shows that even the most modern dry spinner fertilizer applicators with recent calibration can still not achieve accurate spread patterns. In this particular Iowa State University study, the applicator was calibrated to apply 216 pounds of fertilizer material per acre across a 60-foot swath width. But when pan-tested by Iowa State engineers, 30 feet of the 60-foot swath directly behind the midpoint of the applicator only received 177 pounds of fertilizer material per acre. In other words, 40 fewer pounds of fertilizer material than what the machine was calibrated to apply. Liqui-Grow, however, has developed a fertilization systems approach that eliminates the problems associated with inaccurate dry fertilizer applications. We use cost-effective high-nutrient analysis liquid suspension fertilizers that are more viscous than clear liquid fertilizers, but can still be precisely metered with rate controllers and flow meters to ensure every acre of every pass is receiving the agronomic rate of fertilizer prescribed to maximize crop yields and economic returns for our customers.
We are loyal to Liqui-Grow for several different reasons, but first and foremost, we think it's really about the professionalism and the trust that the employees here have, and we have the confidence in their ability to make things happen when we need it done. We know that when we can call Liqui-Grow and have a quality job done very quickly, if the weather's changing on us, we think that that's really important to our operation. So it's about the professionalism and it's about the trust that we have in the people and the equipment that they have here. We're also pleased with the relationship with Liqui-Grow because it's been such a long-standing relationship for us that we've got the confidence in their financial strength and their ability to recommend products to us based on what we need.
I know who the owners are. I feel like they've got their employees, their customers' best interest in mind when it comes to doing business, and I feel really comfortable that if I place money with these guys, not going to be issues down the road, making sure that product gets to my farm, in a very efficient and professional manner.
Really, it's the people, flat out. It's the people that move my business forward because they are the expertise that I need to be a better farmer.
My name is Scott Tinsman, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Liqui-Grow Twin State. For the past 60 years, our success has been driven by the ability to add money to the farmer's pocket. Our belief is if the farmer spends $1 with us, we should be able to provide him $1.50 back.
My name is Hovey Tinsman, President of Liqui-Grow. I believe in liquid suspension fertilizer because it allows us to make the right product at the right time and apply it at the right rate for the most efficient benefit for the plant.
We play an important role in making sure we can get as much information to the farmer that's state-of-the-art as possible.
We prioritize R&D investment because it is our goal to prove in the field ways in which new technologies can make things more profitable for our customer.
What I like the most about working with ag is truly the people. They're just nice people. We're all working toward a common goal, and that is to be the most efficient, productive farmers we can be.
Good morning. Welcome to another Liqui-Grow Lead Academy session. Today we have an excellent presentation by Dr. Jake Vossenkemper. He is going to discuss economic and efficient use of nitrogen fertilizer to maximize yields. Basically, getting as much as you can out of every single drop. He's also going to take some time to review some of his research findings from his 2021 test plots and from research that he's done over the years. It's going to be really good. Also, like we've done in the past, we're going to have live Q&A at the end of this session. And so Jake and I will come back and we'll be here. I'll have questions that you can submit to me either through the chat, which is below the video that you're watching right now. There's a chat function. You can enter questions there, or you can email them to us at questions@liqui-grow.com. Send those questions in, and then we will be back at the end of this presentation for live Q&A with Dr. Vossenkemper. Enjoy the presentation.
Hi, my name is Jake Vossenkemper, Agronomy Lead with Liqui-Grow. So today we're going to have a special lead session that is fully dedicated to nitrogen management, given the unprecedented high nitrogen prices. We'll be having more lead sessions this winter, some in person, some virtual. We had a lot of good feedback on some of the virtual sessions, so we're going to try to do a mix of both this winter. So be looking for those dates. Talk to your Liqui-Grow salesman to find out when we're going to have some more of these lead session events. But like I said, we're going to focus in on nitrogen management today. As I've already stated, nitrogen prices are at records or near record prices. So we want to kind of review some tried and true management practices that can help us be as efficient as possible with our nitrogen fertilizer. We still need to make good yields, but that means we can't afford to lose any of this expensive nitrogen. So with that, I'm very passionate about this subject. I know a lot about nitrogen and nitrogen management. That's some of the stuff that I studied in graduate school. So, you know, this is supposed to be a half-hour discussion today. It could easily go from now until dinner time, but we're going to focus in on some very key subjects that I really think matters to our customers and to growers out there. When we get started here, I want to kind of give you a bulleted list of some things that I want you to learn. You know, given the high price of nitrogen relative to the price of corn, it may be called for to reduce your nitrogen rate a little bit. That'll deliver maximum ROI, and we're going to talk about all these things in much more specific detail. Even without a kilter nitrogen prices, you know, we're making a lot of buying decisions right now based off the price of nitrogen, but we can't forget about the agronomics that really drive yield and really drive ROI. So we're going to talk a little bit about nitrogen timing and some of the recent research on that subject. I think it's important it's probably more important than ever that we use a nitrification inhibitor with pre-plant end sources, particularly in some of those coarser, sandier soils and in some of those soils that tend to be more poorly drained. You know, those are the two environments where nitrification inhibitors that slow nitrification keep that nitrogen in the ammonium form, so therefore it can't be leached or denitrified and float off into the atmosphere. Okay. We want to split up those ATS applications with nitrogen fertilizer. ATS is our sulfur source. ATS happens to have some special properties where it acts as a nitrification inhibitor. Very clear evidence for that. Okay, and we're going to talk a little bit about how you can use that low-cost ATS source to help you keep that nitrogen in a form that can't be lost. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. Don't broadcast high rates of nitrogen fertilizer, particularly in corn on corn. Just don't do it. When I say nitrogen fertilizer, I mean urea or UAN, because they both contain urea. If urea is put on the soil surface and not incorporated, it can go through something called ammonia volatilization and float off into the atmosphere. Don't broadcast high rates of nitrogen. And if you have to, you need to use something called a urease inhibitor, and we'll talk more about that too. Lastly, this is never a good idea, but particularly when nitrogen prices are high, don't broadcast urea in season to corn. You get a poor spread pattern, you have the potential for ammonia volatilization, and those things can lead to yield loss. And finally, we're going to wrap up talking a little bit about some biological products that are being marketed to farmers to replace nitrogen. I've actually done quite a bit of research on those, and we're going to end with that subject because I'm getting a lot of questions right now about those products given the high nitrogen prices. So with that, we're going to get rolling with our presentation. On this first slide, I want to point out, you might notice that I have the term right rate. That's because we're going to talk about nitrogen rate first. But on the remainder of the slides, we're going to continue to follow that 4R theme, right? So it's right rate, right source, right time, and right placement. So as I'm talking, what I'm referring to regarding those 4Rs, I have indicated on the slide. So we're going to start off with rate, right? So the question is, how do you decide what rate of nitrogen you should put on your corn crop, okay? If you don't know about the MRNT calculator, or the maximum return to nitrogen calculator, you should. I'm not going to focus in on what that means or how that was developed today, but Midwestern universities developed that, and that's basically the system in which you should use today to decide to start making this decision about how much nitrogen I should put on my corn. And I want to preface that and say it's a tool to help get you in the right range. Obviously, if you have a sandy soil that's prone to leaching, obviously you're going to want to use a little more nitrogen than what this would suggest. Obviously, if you have nasty hill ground with low organic matter, you're probably going to want to use a little bit more nitrogen than this suggests. If you have poorly drained soils, you're probably going to want to use a little bit more nitrogen than what this suggests. But this is a good place to get you started in making that right decision, okay? So let's talk about that, all right? Really, the discussion around nitrogen should always come back to economics, right? Nitrogen increases corn yields up into a point. After a while, it no longer becomes profitable to put more nitrogen on, right? And in the situation we're in, you can about imagine that, nitrogen still makes corn yield, but it becomes more and more and more costly to put on more and more nitrogen. So at some point, there's this break point between profitability and pure yield, okay? So historically speaking, when corn prices, I took the 10-year corn price average, which is about $4, and I took the 10-year nitrogen, 32% nitrogen price, which is about $2.95 a ton, okay? So if you use those numbers and you plug those numbers into this calculator that's on the Iowa State website, historically speaking, it would tell you to put on roughly around 190 to 200 pounds of nitrogen in corn on corn in the southeast Iowa region. With this calculator, you select your state and the region within your state, and you pick your crop rotation. So for southeast Iowa continuous corn, the historical nitrogen rate that should be used on corn and corn is around that 190 to 200 pounds of N per acre. Now the corn price ratio is flip-flopped a little bit here. We now are in a place where nitrogen is slightly more expensive than the price of corn. So in other words, the ratio of the corn to N price has changed. So today that ratio is higher, meaning nitrogen is more expensive relative to the price of corn than it has been historically. So therefore, you could potentially put on a little less nitrogen fertilizer, or you would need to put on a little less nitrogen fertilizer to maximize ROI. Now these aren't big changes that I'm talking. The nitrogen rate calculator, if you use today's nitrogen and corn prices, is telling you to put on 180 to 190 pounds of nitrogen per acre for continuous corn in southeast Iowa. So it's not a big rate reduction, but 10 pounds of nitrogen costs you a lot more this year than it has previously. So something to keep in mind. The next thing I want to mention is going back to the whole yield versus nitrogen rate. We know that nitrogen increases corn yields. And if you look on this slide here, I have indicated where 182 pounds of nitrogen is the exact economic optimum nitrogen rate for southeast Iowa region and continuous corn. Okay, that is the exact economic optimum nitrogen rate, meaning that if you put another pound of nitrogen on, it's going to become, you're going to be using your nitrogen less profitably than if you put on 182. Okay. Now, that 182 pound nitrogen rate is going to give you 97% of maximum yield. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, I want 100% of maximum yield. And that's fine, but realize to get to 100% of maximum yield, because that curve gets so flat, because it takes, you get a little bit more yield, but you have to put on a lot more nitrogen to get that yield. So just keep in mind, if you want actual maximum yield, you're going to have to put on about another 58 pounds of nitrogen to get absolute maximum yield. And that's only going to get you another 6 bushels. So with the price of nitrogen, it just does not, it becomes cost prohibitive to get absolute maximum yield. So on this first slide of the presentation, we're going to talk about both timing and rate. Now there is a lot on this slide we could talk about for a long time, so I want you to study it, take a look at it, and I'm just going to basically lay out some of the key points, okay? Like I said, whether side dressing is more profitable than pre-plant in applications would take some intimate conversations to help you understand if that's what you need to be doing, okay? But this is an example of what we might see on average. This study was done at the University of Minnesota. It was published in 2020, okay? It was a 3-year study from 2014 to 2016, and a total of 6 sites. And these are soils in Minnesota that are very similar to a lot of the silt loam soils in the state of Iowa. Nitrogen should be pretty similar in these studies. Nitrogen should behave similar in these studies as it would in most of the state of Iowa, okay? So it's very irrelevant to us. And I might add that I left the sandy site out because side dressing looked really good in the sandy site, of course, right? But these are the silt loam soils that many of us farm in and operate in today. So is what they did is they applied 2 different N rates. They applied those N rates in the fall. One was a normal N rate, which was 188 pounds of nitrogen, and one was an elevated N rate. Before I go any further, the price you see that I call partial profit on here is the yield of these individual treatments times the price of corn minus the cost of the nitrogen. So that's the money you have left to pay for rent, other crop inputs, so on and so forth. So I call it partial profit, okay? So that's what the blue bars indicate, and the numbers at the top of the blue bars are the partial profit according to these treatments. So back to the treatments, we had fall applied in, one at a high rate, one at a normal rate. Then we had a series of pre-plant applications that were split amongst different side dress timings. Okay, so in the spring, we had that same 188 pounds of nitrogen all applied pre-plant. We then had that same 188 pounds of nitrogen split between at planting and V6 time, side dress timing. The last treatment we had split 3 ways, one at planting, one application at V6, and one at VTR1, all right? The other numbers I want to point out briefly above the profit, partial profit, is the nitrogen use efficiency. So that's what percentage of your nitrogen fertilizer was actually used to produce corn grain yield, all right? I'm going to point out one thing to you. This is using today's nitrogen prices, so really expensive UAN relative to pretty expensive anhydrous ammonia, but that gap is wider at the moment. So if anything, when that gap is more normal, we should see potentially the side dress application being more profitable because it yielded more, all right? But you'll notice that both the fall applications, either at the high rate or the lower rate or the normal rate, had pretty much the lowest nitrogen use efficiency. But notice that the pre-plant 50% and the pre-planted side dress had the highest nitrogen use efficiency. And I would think that with high fertilizer prices, you would want to get as much of that expensive nitrogen you paid for in the crop because that's going to give you the highest yield potential. Now you might be asking, and the highest profit. Now you might be asking, why did the 3-way split application not do better than it did? It was as good as the pre-plant and the high rate applied in the fall, but it was not superior. And that's because these late side dress applications are at risk of not getting into the crop. Don't get me wrong, I like the wide drop system. I like putting that nitrogen right along the row. I think that's a great way to put on in. Nothing wrong with it. But what we often get into is these V12, V15, R1 applications because we run out of time. The problem with that is that it gets dry at that part of the year, and it takes decent soil moisture to move that nitrate into the growing crop. So oftentimes those applications are too late and we don't use that nitrogen effective as we could. In fact, there was a University of Minnesota study also recently published that they looked at all kinds of different side dress nitrogen timings over a bunch of different locations and years, and they found that you really don't want to be side dressing corn after V10. So that V9, V10 time frame is where I would try to have all my wide dropping and or general side dressing completed. All right. I'll also note that when you applied 235 pounds of nitrogen in the fall, that treatment yielded pretty well, okay? But you had to apply 25% more than the normal rate to get that decent yield. And it still wasn't the most profitable because you had to put on a lot of nitrogen fertilizer to overcome the loss conditions that happen over the winter and the early spring months. So on average, in soils that are similar to a lot of the state of Iowa, side dressing is a good decision. And really the reason it's a good decision is in a wet year, you have a wet spring, you have nitrogen loss. If it's in the tank, it's as simple as that. It can't be lost. So basically what you're doing is you're avoiding a few 1, 2, 3, 4 inch rains in that April to beginning of June timeframe. Basically, it's the month of May, all right? If you can avoid a couple big rains and you don't have that nitrogen out there, you're not going to lose it, and that's what it comes down to. And 1 out of 6, 1 out of 5, 1 out of 4 years, we have a really wet period. And that's when you're going to get 20, 30, 40, 50 bushel from a side dress application. And that will carry you for years to come regarding what the average profitability of a system is. So I know there's not a lot of acres out there that are side dressed, but it's a good approach. If you have time, you can get it done. So that was a lot. We're going to move on to the next subject. We're going to start talking about nitrification inhibitors. And this actually leads me into the next conversation, because I've had many farmers and ag retail salesmen say, well, why don't I just use a nitrification inhibitor with my pre-plant application, and that's going to carry you 3 or 4 weeks anyway. So it's basically going to protect that nitrogen long enough so we can avoid those in-loss conditions. And I think that's a decent point. There's not a lot of studies that have been done out there on that, but if you don't have the time and the equipment to get it done, I think that's a good second best, is to use a nitrification inhibitor with that main nitrogen source pre-plant that you're putting on, because I think that's also going to help you avoid these big in-loss conditions. Keep in mind, it doesn't stop in-loss. Nitrification inhibitors don't stop in-loss, because over time, more of that nitrogen still transforms into nitrate, which is that leachable form that can be lost via groundwater or to the atmosphere as denitrification. So I think that's a good second best, okay? And that's going to lead us into our nitrification inhibitor discussion. So this is actually a slide straight from the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy. And these are, according to the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy, these are proven practices to reduce nitrate concentrations in tile drains. And should we be surprised that moving from fall to spring applications, you get less nitrate in tile drains, which means you have more nitrate in the soil, which means the crop can take it up and you have higher yield potential. This also says that, guess what? Side dressing in lowers the concentration of nitrate in the tile lines, which means it's in the soil, which gives you higher yield potential. It also says that if you use a nitrification inhibitor, you have less nitrogen in the tile lines, which means there's more nitrogen in the soil available for crop uptake and a higher yield potential. Okay, so everything I just talked about aligns right with the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy of strategies to keep nitrogen out of the environment and keep it in your crop, which is what you want. All right, and that has become increasingly important with high nitrogen prices. So now we're going to move on, and I'm going to explain to you what a nitrification inhibitor is, and a little bit more about some of the ways in which they can be used. So what is a nitrification inhibitor? A nitrification inhibitor is just a chemical compound that slows the conversion of ammonium to nitrate. Ammonium is positively charged, it sticks to the soil very well. Nitrate is negatively charged, and it can be leached into the tile systems or deeper in the groundwater, or it can be nitrified and can float off in the atmosphere as nitrogen gas. Okay? 2 very legitimate proven products that can do that are the chemical compounds are DCD and nitropyrin. Both are effective nitrification inhibitors. There's some other products out there that are promoted to reduce or slow nitrification, but they don't do a super good job. These 2 products, there's some newer ones on the market that may as well, but these 2 products have been around for a long time and they're proven to work and do their job. Okay? Now, I talk to some farmers and tell me, well, I've tried a nitrification inhibitor and it didn't work. Well, as I continue to explore the conversation and ask them more questions, sometimes or oftentimes I find out that they're using a rate of nitrogen that's pretty high in the first place. So if you're using a nitrogen rate that's very high, it's not likely that using a nitrification inhibitor is going to make you more money or increase your profitability, because you already have the system overloaded with nitrogen in the first place. So using something else to keep nitrogen in the soil system isn't necessarily going to help you out. However, nitrogen input is going to cost you around $100 an acre or a little bit more. So we're in a situation, a place where we can no longer afford just to overload the system and hope for the best. Because nitropyrin, for example, as instinct, is now, you can buy only 10 pounds of nitrogen for what the instinct cost, where before you could buy 20 or 25 pounds of nitrogen. So it's much more cost effective to start thinking about a nitrification inhibitor, okay? Now I've rambled on about that for a while, but what the science says about these nitrification inhibitors is there's somewhere between about a 3 and 5% yield increase on average to using a nitrification inhibitor as opposed to not using one. So this is a meta-analysis, and what that means is it's a whole bunch of scientific studies that have compiled into one study, and you can basically pound averages together and find out if an effect is significant on average or not, okay? So on average, we would expect that a nitrification inhibitor like Instinct would increase corn yields approximately 3 to 5% on average. Keeping in mind that in a dry year, or if you're putting on lots of nitrogen in the first place, it probably isn't going to do anything for you. But if you're using normal N rates, or if you have a wet year, a nitrification inhibitor is likely going to create a large, decent yield advantage in a year where it's very wet, or if you have very coarse soils like sandy soils or silty soils. So again, it's a conversation that we need to sit down really and have one-on-one with your individual operation, understand, is this a product for you? But on average, we do see yield increases with nitrification inhibitors in general, and profitable ones too, I might add. So again, this kind of goes back to where I was. Oftentimes I get the argument, well, why don't I just put on more nitrogen? Why should I use an inhibitor? Well, another kind of fact that's a little bit hard to grasp, but it's true, nitrogen loss isn't on a 1-to-1 ratio. So as you apply more nitrogen, you just lose it faster via denitrification. So if you just add another 20 pounds, well, you're just going to lose that 20 pounds even faster than if you didn't put on that 20 pounds and protect that nitrogen with a nitrification inhibitor. So you lose nitrogen more rapidly as rate increases. So putting on more isn't necessarily the answer. So now we're going to talk about ATS as a mild nitrification inhibitor. So you might be asking what ATS is. ATS is an acronym for ammonium thiosulfate, and that's actually the sulfur source that we use, okay? ATS happens to have nitrification inhibition properties. I'm going to let you study this slide on your own, but basically is what this slide says. It says that, yes, ATS is a nitrification inhibitor, but it's about half as effective as DCD or nitropyrin, which is Instinct, okay? So what do you do with this, all right? Well, if you're going to use nitropyrin, you're going to use that nitropyrin with your main end source. So let's say you're going to put on 100 pounds of nitrogen before planting, okay? That's where you should probably put the nitropyrin because it's most effective. It's going to protect that 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre, all right? But let's say you're putting on some nitrogen with the planter. Let's say you're putting on some nitrogen with the herbicide. Let's say you're putting on some nitrogen in season. And maybe those are 20, 30, 40 pounds of nitrogen per acre. That's the place, you still want to protect that nitrogen, and that's the place where I would use ammonium thiosulfate to help protect that nitrogen. So it doesn't take a lot, all right? So let's just say it doesn't take a lot of ATS. Let's just, for assumption purposes, talk about this. If you're putting on 100 gallons of UAN, it only takes 5 gallons of ATS and 100 gallons of UAN to get this nitrification inhibition. So it doesn't take much to get this nitrification inhibition process. So is what I would do if I were you, I would split up my sulfur applications amongst my different small N applications you put on here or there. I think that's going to be the most effective place to use ATS as a nitrification inhibitor. If you have some in that main N load, great. But I think, and if you're not using nitropyrin, that's where I would put it. But if you are, I would put this ATS in many of my other small N applications that you tend to make throughout the year. So we just got done talking about denitrification and leaching. And to stop those processes, we need to use a nitrification inhibitor like DCD or Instinct, which is nitropyrin, okay? And if you recall, leaching is movement into the groundwater, into the tile lines, out of the soil system where your crop can't get it. Denitrification is when water sits and that nitrate turns into dinitrogen gas or nitrous oxide and floats away into the atmosphere, okay? Now we're going to talk about ammonia volatilization. And ammonia volatilization is when urea sits on the soil surface and then it turns into ammonia gas and also floats off into the atmosphere, okay? To stop this ammonia volatilization process where ammonia gas floats off into the atmosphere, that's when we want to start talking about using a urease inhibitor. Now, some trade names for urease inhibitors, the common one you might hear is agritane. Limus is a product that was sold by BASF. There's actually many products out there marketed as urease inhibitors, and they mostly contain the compound NBPT, okay? So if you see NBPT, that's a urease inhibitor, all right? So when would we use a urease inhibitor? We would use a urease inhibitor, well, first and foremost, I would avoid broadcasting urea, granular urea, or UAN in large quantities across the soil surface, okay? And the reason I say that is that urea is susceptible to ammonia volatilization when it's laying on the soil surface. I don't advise that in general, large quantities of it, but if you're going to do that, that's a situation in a place where you'd want to use a urease inhibitor. And I might back up and review for a second. UAN is liquid nitrogen, but it's half liquid urea. So UAN is susceptible to ammonia volatilization. About half as much as dry urea, because dry urea is 100% urea, okay? But those are situations when you broadcast apply large amounts of UAN or urea where you would want to use a urease inhibitor, all right? I'm not talking about the 15 or 20 pounds of nitrogen you might use with your herbicides when you broadcast UAN with your herbicides, but I'm talking about these big main N applications where you're broadcasting in the spring. Now, if you incorporate that, either dry urea or UAN, that will stop the ammonia volatilization process. It's only when it's not incorporated. All right. Now, let's talk a little bit about banding, how much banding with surface applications can help. All right. So we do band apply UAN in a lot of circumstances with our floaters. You know, 100, 115, 120, 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre, we are putting in a band on 15-inch centers and applying that to the soil surface. But we know just by banding, you can reduce the potential for ammonia volatilization a lot, even without an inhibitor. And that's the case because there's an enzyme that lives in the soil called the urease enzyme, and that enzyme itself causes that ammonia volatilization to occur. But if you put it in a tight band, you are physically reducing the amount of the surface area of the fertilizer that's exposed to that enzyme. And you can see in this graph here that banding nitrogen itself greatly reduces ammonia volatilization. The last topic I want to touch on is broadcasting urea in season as granular dry urea. So there's a couple problems associated with that. You know, in general, with any dry fertilizer, you have generally you have a higher amount of that fertilizer that comes right out of the back of the machine, and then that rate tapers off as we enter the edges of the machines. And that just in general happens, all right? But when you're applying urea in season, and you have a standing crop in the way that disrupts that normal spread pattern, you have an even higher quantity of that fertilizer, that urea fertilizer, that's magnified in the middle of that machine. And you can see that in this figure from Iowa State here that's with me. In that case, the target rate that of actual dry urea product they wanted to apply was 100 pounds per acre. But as what they found, you know, in the middle 15, 20, 30 foot of that machine, they had rates that were approaching 300 pounds of product per acre when the target rate was 100. And on the outsides of those machines, you know, they were getting as little as 50 pounds of actual urea product per acre. So that study from Iowa State University clearly shows that broadcasting urea in crop is not a good idea if you want uniform distribution of fertilizer and to maximize yield. Now, I've also been on a number of service calls looking at these problems in real time in the field. And this picture here is one example of that. You can clearly see that the yellow corn was associated with the lower urea rates on the outside of that machine. And the nice dark green corn was associated with the high rates in the middle of that machine. Now, I've actually investigated this to some extent on my own in some on-farm studies where we cooperate with actual growers to do on-farm strip trials, okay? So we did this back in 2016. We had 3 on-farm studies. The average yield for the band-applied UAN in these studies was 239, and the average yield for the broadcast-applied urea at the same rate was 233. When you subtracted out the added cost for the UAN and you took that and you turned it into profit, we had about a $16 per acre profit for using banded UAN versus broadcasted urea. The last point I want to make today is I've been getting lots of phone calls over the last 2 weeks about biological products that can replace some of the nitrogen requirements for corn. So there's about 3 companies out there that are heavily marketing biological products or bacteria that can reportedly pull nitrogen out of the atmosphere, turn it into ammonia, which then becomes plant available. Okay, I am not against that idea. Frankly, I think it's a great idea. I think that would be good for the ag industry. I think it'd be good for our company. I think it'd be good for farmers. I think it'd be good for the environment. I think it's a great idea that should be explored. And there are companies that are exploring it. But in practical terms, I think we need to be asking the question very clearly, is this really a viable alternative even for a small amount of actual nitrogen fertilizer? So I took a very independent evaluation of some of those key products, which I have on the slide here. I've looked at them over multiple sites and multiple years. And unfortunately, to my dismay, I haven't found at one site in 1 year that these products can financially help the farmer increase their profitability. So it's early. These companies have lots of money right now. They're doing lots of R&D. We can only hope that they will come up with something. And I will continue to investigate and look at these products as time goes forward. And if that changes, I will surely let you know. But in the meantime, I would be very cautious about applying these products on lots of acres. And if you're going to do it, I would keep it to a strict trial basis and make sure the product that you're purchasing can actually replace the nitrogen fertilizer that we know has grown good corn for years. All right, that was a lot to get through in a half hour. I kind of want to review some of the main points that I went through, and these are really the things that I want you to take home today. All right, there may be a slight rate reduction in order given that the price of corn relative to the price of nitrogen is higher now than it has been in some time. And remember, that was on about a 10 pound per acre order, so it's not huge, but it's going to be slightly more profitable to apply a little less nitrogen than it was historically for the last 10 years. Okay, apply nitrogen in the spring and not in the fall. Side dressing definitely can reduce yield variability, and it can increase profitability when you look at it on a long-term basis. Again, that's a very general comment. There are lots of situations and lots of soils out there, but that's a general comment that I think is tried and true. And that's even the case with crazy out-of-kilter UAN and hydrous ammonia prices. And I showed you a study from the University of Minnesota. I walked you through kind of the profitability of those scenarios and the yield produced and the nitrogen use efficiency. Use a nitrification inhibitor with pre-plant end sources, particularly in well-drained soils or in poorly drained soils where we're most susceptible to losing that nitrogen. Banding nitrogen surface applied is a great thing to do. I would not broadcast large amounts of UAN or urea on the soil surface without incorporation. If you're going to do that, use a urease inhibitor. And do not broadcast urea in season to corn. You get a bad spread pattern because you get a heavy rate of urea or nitrogen fertilizer behind the middle of those dry machines. You don't get enough fertilizer on the outsides of those passes. That can lead to ammonia volatilization because the urea is sitting on the soil surface and can reduce yields. So you're losing nitrogen that you paid for, and you're also potentially losing profitability and lost yield. So that is one thing for a couple of very good reasons I would not do. Thank you for your time. We went through a lot today. I hope you got something out of it, and I'm looking forward to answering your questions.
Lead Academy.
Liqui-Grow
Excellence.
And agronomy
development.
Hello, welcome back. Hope you enjoyed that presentation. We are here with Dr. Jake Vossenkemper. Hello,
Good morning,
how are
everyone.
you? And we have some questions that we are going to go over. I've printed some of the questions off that have come through over the email. Also, at any point in time, you can still add questions in the chat below. So we'll be watching that as we go through these questions and then get to any that come through over YouTube. So Jake, first question for you is, I typically put on fall ammonia, and then the rest of my nitrogen is 32 in the spring with my chemicals. I put on my ammonia already in late October, but we've had some pretty mild days. Should I be increasing my 32 rate for spring? Will my nitrogen still be there?
Well, that's $1 million question, literally, because you're right. We have had some warm temperatures. I think it's supposed to be in the upper 60s tomorrow here in the Quad Cities. You know, that will cause the soil temperature spike, especially if it's sunny, which it's supposed to be. And no doubt, I mean, there's going to be some of that fall ammonia that's going to start to nitrify and turn into nitrate, and that can cause some end loss. But the real question, Lisa, is, you know, is this warm streak going to continue? Or are we going to get really cold again? We likely will. How wet is it going to be the rest of the winter and this spring? I mean, there's really a lot of unknowns to really answer that question well, okay? The options are, you know, if you put on a pretty heavy rate of N as anhydrous, I probably wouldn't be too concerned at this point about adding more, 32% this spring per se. I think we just need to see how the rest of the winter and the spring goes to make that call. But there are a couple things you can do come this spring. You can do some pre-side dress nitrogen testing, which is basically it's a nitrate sample that's been correlated to crop yield. So in other words, you can take this sample. If the soil is deficient in nitrate at about the V4, V5 growth stage of corn, then you can add some at that point and make sure you maximize yield. There's also an imagery company that I talked about called Envision Ag in one of our previous lead sessions. That would be a great option. Basically, you would start getting images around that V8, V9, V10 time frame, and that will tell you if you're deficient in nitrogen or not. So those are kind of the two things that, you know, I would lean on at this point to really, with the lack of environmental and or weather information we have today relative to what's going to happen this spring, those are the two things I would tell you that I would consider doing at this point in time.
So if somebody wants to, you know, delay the decision but do some testing to, you know, make decisions when spring or planting season does get closer, how soon should they be reaching out to someone from Liqui-Grow to start setting that up?
Well, I would say the sooner the better. I mean, having a plan is 9/10 of the battle.
Okay.
So today, I mean, literally, I mean, it's never too early to start planning. You know, if you're planning on side dressing, because either of these approaches we just talked about is a side dress approach.
Okay.
Because when the 32% is going on with the herbicide, it's likely still going to be too early to make any judgment call. I mean, you can't use the crop sensing because the crop's not there, and the PSNT test isn't designed to be used until about V5. So, you know, those are the two best options I have for you, and they are the best options that I've seen. So you really can't, you're going to have to be prepared to side dress if you want to make any corrections based on some predictions of how much N is actually left in the soil.
Okay.
So, you know, be prepared. Reach out to your Liqui-Grow representative. You know, do they have side dress toolbars? Can they do custom side dressing? You know, it depends on the location, but the answer in a lot of cases is yes.
Okay, great. Okay, here's another question coming in from Cedar County. Jake, I farm in Cedar County, corn and beans, some corn on corn. We don't use N-Serve or Instinct. We have never seen a yield increase out of it. Our thoughts are we should just put the money towards ammonia and 32. You mentioned these products are legit. Why do you think we are not seeing increases?
I think there are a lot of reasons why you might not be seeing yield increases from using Instinct or any other nitrification inhibitor. And this is the part where I said it really comes down to an intimate conversation about your operation and what you're doing. But I'm going to give you a few things to think about.
Okay.
And it really will take a lot more in-depth conversation to really help me answer that question, but I'm going to give you a few things to think about. Number one, I'd ask you to think about what nitrogen rate are you using in general, right? So, you know, let's pretend it's a corn-soybean rotation. You know, typically, depending on the price of nitrogen, the price of corn, but typically a corn-soybean rotation, historically speaking, you're looking at about 160 to 170 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Should be pretty adequate, okay? But if you're using 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre in a corn-soybean rotation, you're already putting on 20, 30, 40 more pounds than you need to anyway. So you can afford to lose 20, 30, 40 pounds of nitrogen year in and year out, and it's not going to hurt your yield per se. So adding a product that's going to keep that 200 pounds there, you're probably not very often going to be indeficient or even close to being indeficient to begin with. So because you have a luxurious amount of nitrogen out there, adding an inhibitor to keep more nitrogen there probably isn't going to help you out. Okay, so that would be kind of the first question I'd ask you if you were here today. The second question I'd ask you is, what kind of soil types are we dealing with here? You know, when I hear Cedar County, I hear a lot of silt loam soils that tend to be, you know, pattern tiled and or you know, pretty good tile network. So you're going to have that perfect balance of not too poorly drained, but also have adequate drainage where you don't have a lot of denitrification. You know, you don't have excessive drainage, you're not worried about leaching. You don't have a lot of ponding water, so you're not worried about denitrification. So, you know, those are the two places where, you know, a nitrification inhibitor like Instinct or DCD can really help you out. So, you know, there's some environments that have the perfect balance between drainage, you know, and not having excessive drainage and not having ponding water where, you know, maybe in those situations for sure, you know, it isn't as often to need a nitrification inhibitor because it's a perfect environment. Okay. The last thing that I would have a conversation with you about is, you know, if you tested a nitrification inhibitor in 1 year and you said, okay, I've made my decision, I'm not using it.
Okay.
Unfortunately, with the way the environments play out, that's not going to answer the question because it takes a year where we have a lot of rainfall, you know, average to above average rainfall to really get those leaching and those denitrification conditions that cause a lot of in-loss. Okay, so you're going to find that in a wet year, that's when the nitrification inhibitor is really going to pay off. Like, for example, you could go 2, 3, 4 years and never see an economic payback from a nitrification inhibitor. But in that year, in May and early June, where you had a lot of rainfall and you're leaching a lot of nitrogen and you're denitrifying a lot of nitrogen, you may get a 20, 30, 40 bushel yield increase, and I'm not kidding you. In 2015, the first year I was here doing research, I forget off the cuff, Lisa, exactly what it was, but it was like a 20 some odd bushel yield increase at the Walcott test plots from Instinct. You know, and that 20 bushel yield increase, you know, that paid for the Instinct for the next 3 or 4 years. I mean, so it's an environmental situation that you're going to find yourself in when you get these big yield increases from a nitrification inhibitor. And that's just the facts. I mean, that's just what we deal with. That's ag. That's the environment. And you're going to find that when you have big yield increases, it's in these wetter years. And so if you're testing in 1 year and it's not a wetter year, I'm not surprised if you're not seeing a small yield increase or no yield increase, and you're not seeing it in your test. So.
And that was going to be my follow-up question. So, in your opinion, does that make sense as a strategy to apply or to use this strategy every year? Because even if it's ineffective 3 years, that 4th year it might be really necessary and would pay for the other years.
Yes, and when you look at lots of data regarding nitrification inhibitors, you're going to see that, you know, I actually in this presentation I shared some data from the University of Minnesota, and in that data there was 1 of 3 years where side dressing paid big time. Okay. And it'd be the same principle for a nitrification inhibitor. You know, there's 1 out of 3 or 1 out of 4 years, you know, you're going to have a wet year, and that's when you're going to see the big payback. And yes, economically speaking, when you look at data sets over a long period of time, it is profitable, particularly if you're not already using a, you know, over luxurious N rate.
Okay, good. Thank you. Okay, here is another question. You mentioned Agritane Plus as a Urease inhibitor. Are there other products that are effective?
Yes, I mentioned Agritane Plus because it is kind of the most popular, you know, historically speaking, it's been the most popular urease inhibitor, okay? There's lots of other products out there. In fact, NBPT, which is the active ingredient that I want you to look for. The bottom line is, if you want to use a urease inhibitor, you need to be looking at the label and looking for the active ingredient that's NBPT or NPPT. Those 2 active ingredients clearly are effective urease inhibitors. Okay. Now there's lots of trade names of products out there on the market. There's a bunch more that's come on the market in the last 3 or 4 years because that NBPT it's off patent. So, now anybody can manufacture it. So there's been lots of those products that have come on the market. Agrotane Plus is still a very popular product on the market. Pentamax is a Corteva Urease inhibitor that's got NBPT in it. So those are two very common products, and there's lots of them. The bottom line is look for that active ingredient NBPT or the combination of NBPT and NPPT.
Okay, thank you. Another question.
And if that active ingredient's not in there, I'd be a little bit nervous about it being effective.
Okay,
So
good advice. Okay, this is kind of a follow-up about the Instinct product again. Could you review what forms of nitrogen loss Instinct stops? I thought it stopped all forms of nitrogen loss, but in your presentation, now I'm thinking differently.
that is a great question, and I'll be honest with you, there's a lot of confusion about that because there's a lot of companies that market nitrification inhibitors and urease inhibitors, and a lot of times they're just called N stabilizers. So that's an excellent question, and I'll do my best to clear that up. So Instinct is a nitrification inhibitor.
Mm-hmm.
All nitrification inhibitors that are legitimate nitrification inhibitors they don't stop anything. They slow it down, number one. So they're going to slow down leaching, and they're going to slow down denitrification. So leaching is the loss mechanism where water takes the nitrate deep.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, denitrification is the end loss mechanism. It happens when you have ponding water and you have microbes that turn the nitrate into dinitrogen gas or nitrous oxide. Okay, so those are the two end loss mechanisms that a nitrification inhibitor is going to stop, like Instinct. The other mechanism is ammonia volatilization, and that's when urea or UAN, because UAN is 50% urea. When urea or UAN sit on the soil surface, they can go through something called ammonia volatilization. And Instinct or any nitrification inhibitor does not stop that. That would be your urease inhibitor, your Agrotane Plus or your Pentamax that I just mentioned. So it's very confusing, but those are the two. It's denitrification and leaching that the nitrification inhibitors stop. And I might add, those are the two biggest in-loss mechanisms that we worry about. So, if you're using Instinct or another nitrification inhibitor that has DCD in it, which is another, proven active ingredient, that's the most important one to use. Out of if you're talking about a urease inhibitor or a nitrification inhibitor, the nitrification inhibitor, if I had to pick, is the most important because those are the two biggest in-loss mechanisms, leaching and denitrification.
Okay. So this question says, should I use Instinct when I side dress?
That's another great question. Lots of questions about Instinct, I see. That's another great question, and I think, unfortunately, it depends. And let me walk you through why I say that. So if you're applying, it seems like there's 50 different ways to get your nitrogen on your corn, okay? So I'm going to give you one example that I've seen. It's not the most popular, but it happens. Let's say you put 20, 30, 40 pounds of nitrogen or 50 pounds of nitrogen down with your herbicide pre-plant, broadcast applied, okay? And then you're going to come back and you're going to side dress 110, 120 pounds. When that happens, in a lot of cases, we're getting out there as soon as you can row the corn and you're side dressing. So you're out there the middle of May or the end of May side dressing your corn as soon as it's coming out of the ground. In that case, it's early enough and the crop isn't demanding a lot of nitrogen at that point where you're putting these very early side dress applications on. In a very early side dress application where the majority of your nitrogen's going on at that time, yes, I think at that time it's still worthwhile using a nitrification inhibitor like Instinct.
Okay.
But if you're out there at V6, V7, V8, V9, V10, at that point you're gonna, at that point you're really gonna start ramping up in demand. So I don't know that it's necessary to keep the nitrogen in the ammonium form longer at that point. You want it converting to nitrate. You want it to be mobile. You want it getting into the crop. You also are going to have fewer instances where you're exposed to loss because we're later in the season and the corn's taking it up, right? So for those two reasons, I don't think it's necessary to use Instinct at the, let's call it the V5 time and beyond, okay? At that V2, V3, it takes quite a while to get things going there just because corn grows based on temperatures. At that point, if you're putting on most of your nitrogen, at that V2, V3, when you can first row the corn, then I think it's still worth it. But if we're getting out there V5, V6 and beyond, I think I would withhold it at that point.
Okay.
And that's typically not, when you're side dressing at V5, V6 and beyond, that's typically not your main end load anyway. And typically we want to put the instinct in your main end source.
Okay.
And that's because it's most cost effective, because that instinct's going to protect, that instinct's going to protect, you want to put the instinct where you're putting on the most nitrogen, because you want to protect the biggest quantity of nitrogen. So,
Okay,
all
great.
right.
Yes, thank you. Okay, one more question from the email, and then I'll check the chat. You mentioned to add ATS to all my nitrogen applications because it's a mild nitrogen stabilizer. Shouldn't we be more focused on applying the ATS at the right time to maximize yield and ROI, as opposed to focusing on its mild nitrogen stabilization properties?
Yeah, that is also a great question. And generally the answer is, I'm not overly concerned about when we put our sulfur on, as long as we're getting it on pre-V5, V6-ish time frame, the
Okay.
majority of it, okay? And the reason I say that is, if you're a customer of ours, for example, and you're putting on our suspension fertilizer, you're probably going to get at least 5 pounds on in the fall, and there's a reason why we do that, and I don't want to get into that today per se, but there's a good chance you're either getting on 5 pounds in the fall, or maybe you're putting on your suspension fertilizer in the spring, you're getting some there. The bottom line is, if you have 5 to 10 pounds on out front before the crop's planted, that's enough to take you quite a ways.
Okay.
So in that case, you could put 5 to 10 pounds of sulfur on with whatever nitrogen source you're using pre-plant, and that's enough to get you going. If you side dress, for example, put another 5 to 10 pounds on with your side dress application, and that's fine, because you're not going to need that extra sulfur until you get out to that V10, V15 time frame. So the nice thing about ATS and sulfur in general is that there's a lot of flexibility on application timing. So there's not a lot of research out there that says, boy, you've got to have it all on pre-plant, or you got to have it all on at side dress. It doesn't say that. There's a lot of flexibility in when that sulfur needs to go on, as long as you have 5 to 10 pounds or so on up front. But
Okay.
the rest of it can be put on, side dress timing. There's some flexibility there, is the bottom line.
Okay, good, thank you. Let's check, any questions from the chat? Okay, so all of our questions came in over email today. We don't
Okay.
have any questions from the chat. And I'll just take this opportunity to thank you.
No, thank you,
Your
Lisa.
presentation was excellent. And also, I want to remind everyone that we will be having another Lead Academy series this winter. So last year we did some sessions in the month of February, and we're going to do that again. We will also, like we did last year, be bringing in some partners to speak for us. We had some really good experts from outside of our area of expertise that gave some great presentations, and we're going to incorporate that. And we will have, like I said, another series of virtual webinars. And so that schedule is being built right now with all the content, but just be on the lookout for that, or get in touch with your Liqui-Grow rep so that you know when those are coming out and when we will start hosting those, and that way you can log on and watch live and add questions through the chat and email. We're really looking forward to it. So we hope you have a great holiday season, and we will see you in 2022.
Thanks for watching.